The bells of St. Matthias Cathedral rang with the hollow resonance of finality, their bronze voices carrying across the snow-laden courtyards of Hohenberg Palace like the last breath of a dying season. Each toll seemed to pierce through Princess Emilia's carefully constructed composure, though her face remained a marble mask of appropriate grief as she stood beside her father's gilded coffin. The morning air bit at her cheeks with crystalline teeth, turning her breath into ghostly plumes that rose and disappeared like prayers unheard. Snowflakes caught in the black silk of her mourning veil, each one a tiny star extinguished against the darkness of her loss. King Wilhelm III lay within that ornate prison of gold and ebony, his hands folded in eternal peace, while his kingdom trembled on the precipice of chaos. Father, she thought, her gloved fingers tightening imperceptibly around her prayer book, how am I to face this storm without your steady hand to guide me? The citizens of Bavaria had gathered in the courtyard below, their faces etched with more than ceremonial sorrow. Emilia caught fragments of whispered conversations that made her blood run cold, words like poison and murder drifting upward on the winter wind. The official proclamation spoke of sudden illness, but the court physician's nervous glances and the Duke of Rostein's barely concealed satisfaction told a different tale entirely. As the processional began its solemn march toward the cathedral's towering doors, Emilia felt the weight of 100 watching eyes. Some gazed with genuine sympathy, others with the calculating hunger of wolves scenting weakness. Without her father's protection, she had become the most valuable piece on a chessboard where the rules changed with each player's whim. It was then that she noticed him. The man whose arrival had been announced with such ceremony the previous evening. Lord Nathaniel Harrow stood among the military contingent, his scarlet regimental uniform, a splash of color against the sea of morning black. Even at this distance, she could see the sharp angles of his face, the way his dark hair caught snowflakes like a crown of diamonds. He was handsome in the dangerous way of storms and sword edges, beautiful and devastating in equal measure. A betrothed. The word sat strange and heavy in her mind, a reality thrust upon her in the chaos following her father's death. A diplomatic arrangement, they had called it, a union to strengthen the kingdom in its hour of need. Yet as she watched, Lord Harrow, one detail struck her as profoundly wrong. While every other soul present kept their gaze fixed upon the coffin in reverent attention, Nathaniel's eyes looked everywhere else. The cathedral spires, the gathered crowd, the grey winter sky, anywhere but at the golden casket that held her father's remains. His jaw was set in a line of such rigid control that she wondered what emotions he fought to contain. Twilight. In the hushed corridors of Hohenberg Palace, where portraits of long-dead monarchs seemed to watch with painted eyes, Princess Emilia had always found solace in the library her father built for her education. It was there, among leather-bound volumes of history and philosophy, that she had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics with the same precision her ancestors had once wielded swords. Her tutors had whispered that such learning was wasted on a woman, that her role required only beauty, obedience, and the ability to produce heirs. But King Wilhelm had recognized the sharp intelligence behind his daughter's cornflower blue eyes, even as he struggled to balance his love for her with the harsh realities of royal duty. A princess must be both rose and thorn, he had once told her, his weathered hands turning the pages of a treatise on statecraft. Beautiful enough to inspire loyalty, sharp enough to command it. Now, as she sat in the same chair where she had received that wisdom, Emilia understood how prophetic those words had been. The Privy Council treated her with the patronizing courtesy reserved for decorative objects, valuable, fragile, and ultimately powerless. Duke Rostein's eyes followed her with the predatory patience of a man who saw her crown as his rightful prize. But it was the mystery of Lord Nathaniel Harrow that truly consumed her thoughts. Lady Helena, her sharp-tongued maid and the closest thing to a friend she possessed in this gilded cage, had gathered intelligence about the man with the efficiency of a seasoned spy. Born to dirt and risen to title through blood and brilliance, Helena reported as she brushed Emilia's hair before the mirror. They say he can outthink generals twice his age and outfight men half again his size. The king favored him, but the nobles— She paused, her dark eyes meeting Emilia's in the glass. They call him the farmer's son behind his back, as if courage and intelligence were birthrights of blood rather than gifts of character. Emilia had heard the whispers herself, how Nathaniel's family had perished in the Great Famine of 1808, how he had clawed his way from tenant farming to military glory through sheer determination. The tragedy had forged him into something harder than the pampered sons of nobility, a man who understood suffering in ways her sheltered existence never could. Yet there were darker rumors too, shadows that clung to his name like morning mist to a battlefield. Captain Dernwald, her father's former bodyguard, had grown notably quiet whenever Lord Harrow's name arose in conversation. The old soldier's weathered face would close like a shuttered window, his eyes distant with secrets she could not fathom. The kingdom itself seemed to hold its breath in these uncertain days. Beyond the palace walls, the common folk struggled with harsh taxes and dwindling grain stores, while the nobility danced through another season of extravagant balls. The divide between rich and poor had grown into a chasm that threatened to swallow them all, a reality her father had tried desperately to address before his sudden death. "Your Highness," Helena whispered urgently, breaking through Emilia's brooding thoughts, "there's something you must know about tomorrow's betrothal ceremony. I've heard the servants talking." The maid's words were cut short by a soft knock at the chamber door. When it opened, Lord Harrow himself stood framed in the doorway, his presence filling the room with an energy that made Emilia's pulse quicken, despite her wariness. "Your Highness," he said, his voice carrying the cultivated accent of education laid over rougher origins, "I wondered if we might speak privately before tomorrow's ceremony." As Helena curtsied and withdrew, Emilia found herself alone with the man who would soon share her throne and possibly her bed. The thought sent an unexpected flutter through her chest, equal parts anticipation and terror. The great hall blazed with 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in the polished silver and crystal that adorned the tables like scattered stars. The formal announcement of Princess Emilia's betrothal to Lord Nathaniel Harrow required all the pageantry the court could muster, a display of strength and continuity in the face of uncertainty. Emilia moved through the ceremony with practiced grace, her sapphire silk gown rustling softly as she accepted the congratulations of nobles whose smiles never quite reached their eyes. She had expected this evening to feel like a funeral for her freedom, yet found herself surprisingly curious about the man who stood so solemnly beside her. Lord Harrow cut an impressive figure in his dress uniform, the gold braid and medals catching the light as he bowed to each dignitary with precise military courtesy. But Emilia noticed how his shoulders tensed when Duke Rostine approached with his oily smile and calculating gaze. "Such a touching union," the Duke purred, his pale eyes shifting between them like a snake tasting the air. Though one wonders if His Majesty, rest his soul, truly understood the complications of such an arrangement. The insult hung in the air like smoke, its meaning clear to all who heard. A princess and a commoner made lord. What folly could have possessed the late king to sanction such a mismatch? Emilia felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar sting of being dismissed as a pretty fool incapable of choosing her own fate. Before she could formulate a response that would not create a scandal, Nathaniel stepped forward with the fluid grace of a predator. His voice remained perfectly controlled, but something dangerous flickered in his dark eyes. "His Majesty's wisdom," he said quietly, "lay in understanding that true nobility is earned through service, not inherited through accident of birth. But perhaps such distinctions are too subtle for those who have never faced adversity. The rebuke was delivered with such elegant precision that the Duke could only sputter and retreat, his face flushed with impotent rage. Emilia found herself looking at her betrothed with new eyes, recognizing the steel beneath his courtly manner. Later, when the formal presentations concluded and the dancing began, Nathaniel offered her his arm with unexpected gentleness. "Perhaps we might take some air, Your Highness. The evening is fine, despite the cold." They walked together onto the moonlit terrace, where frost painted the stone railings with silver lace. The music from the ballroom drifted through the tall windows, but out here they could speak without the weight of watching eyes. "You defended me," Emilia said, studying his profile in the pale light. "Why?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. "Because you are to be my wife, and I protect what is mine. But more than that." He turned to face her fully, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Because I have watched too many good people be crushed by those who mistake cruelty for strength." There was pain in his voice, old wounds that had never properly healed. Emilia found herself wanting to know more about this complicated man, his struggles, his losses, the experiences that had shaped him into someone who could speak of justice with such quiet passion. "Will you stay at court now?" she asked, "as we prepare for our wedding? If you wish it. Your father granted me apartments in the East Wing before his death. I had thought to use them to better understand the woman I am to marry." His smile held a hint of warmth that transformed his stern features. "Though I suspect you are far more formidable than the court gives you credit for." Their conversation was interrupted by the hurried approach of Captain Dernwald, whose weathered face bore an expression of barely controlled urgency. The old soldier bowed stiffly to them both, before drawing close enough to whisper, "Your Highness, forgive the intrusion, but there is something you must know. The investigation into your father's death. It was not natural causes, and the man responsible—" His eyes flicked nervously toward Nathaniel before returning to her face. "It was someone close to your betrothed who struck the fatal blow." The words hit Emilia like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She felt Nathaniel stiffen beside her, but when she turned to look at him, his face had become an unreadable mask. Right. In the days that followed, Captain Dernwald's cryptic warning, Emilia found herself caught between suspicion and an inexplicable pull toward the man she was meant to marry. Nathaniel had indeed taken up residence in the East Wing, and their daily encounters had begun to form a pattern that felt both dangerous and inevitable. Each morning he would appear in the estate office, where she conducted the business of managing her father's properties, a duty the council considered beneath her notice, but which she pursued with passionate dedication. The sight of her bent-over ledgers and correspondence seemed to surprise him, as if he had expected to find a decorative princess playing with jewels rather than a capable administrator wrestling with crop yields and tenant concerns. "You truly manage all of this yourself?" he asked one morning, his dark eyes scanning the organized chaos of papers spread across her desk. "Someone must care about whether the people have enough grain for winter," she replied, not looking up from the report of harvest yields from the southern provinces. "The council sees only numbers. I see families who will go hungry if we make the wrong decisions." Something in her tone made him step closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. "You speak like someone who has known hardship herself." Emilia's pen stilled on the page. "There are different kinds of cages, Lord Harrow. Golden bars are still bars." It was then that he made an offer that would change everything between them. "If you wish to understand your people better, Perhaps you should learn to defend yourself as they must. I could teach you sword work, strategy, the skills needed to command respect through strength rather than birthright. The lessons began the next afternoon, in a private courtyard, where the sound of clashing steel would not draw unwanted attention. Nathaniel proved to be a patient instructor, his hands gentle but firm as he corrected her stance and guided her movements. The proximity required by the training sent unexpected heat racing through her veins, the brush of his fingers against her wrist as he adjusted her grip, the solid warmth of his chest when he stepped behind her to demonstrate a parry. "Feel the balance of the blade," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as his hands covered hers on the sword's hilt. "It should become an extension of your will, your intention made manifest." Emilia found it difficult to concentrate on his instruction when every nerve in her body seemed attuned to his presence. She had never been touched by a man with such casual intimacy, never felt the strange flutter of anticipation that came from wondering if he felt the same magnetic pull that drew her toward him. During their lessons, she learned that beneath his controlled exterior lay depths of passion and pain she had not suspected. When she mentioned the suffering of the common people, his jaw would tighten with barely suppressed emotion. "I had a sister once," he said quietly one afternoon as they rested between training sessions. "Margaret. She was 12 when the famine came, all bright laughter and wild dreams. She used to say she would marry a prince and live in a palace made of gingerbread." His voice grew rough. "She died in my arms, nothing but skin and bones, while the Duke of Rustine's granaries remained locked and full." The raw grief in his voice brought tears to Emilia's eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and covered his hand with her own, feeling the calluses and old scars that spoke of a harder life than any she had known. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "No child should die for want of bread while others feast in excess." He stared down at their joined hands for a long moment, before carefully pulling away. "That is why your father's reforms mattered so much. He was the first king in living memory to see common people as more than expendable resources." Their conversations revealed how alike they were in their desire for justice, despite the vast difference in their origins. Emilia found herself confessing fears and dreams she had never spoken aloud, her longing to be more than an ornamental princess, her determination to honor her father's memory by continuing his work for the people. One evening, as autumn rains drummed against the library windows, she discovered him standing before her father's portrait with an expression of such complex emotion that it stopped her in her doorway. "He was a good man," Nathaniel said without turning around, "better than he knew." "Did you know him well?" she asked, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "Well enough to mourn his passing." There was something in his voice, guilt perhaps, or regret, that made her study his profile more closely. The moments stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and growing awareness. When he finally turned to face her, the hunger in his dark eyes made her pulse race. They stood there in the candlelight, two people drawn together by forces neither fully understood, balanced on the knife's edge between propriety and desire. Then thunder crashed overhead, and the spell was broken. Nathaniel stepped back with visible effort, his expression closing off once more. "I should return to my chambers," he said quietly. "The servants will talk if I remain here much longer." But as he reached the door, he paused and looked back at her with an expression that made her heart skip. "Good night, Emilia." It was the first time he had spoken her name without her title, and the intimacy of it sent warmth flooding through her chest. That night, she lay awake thinking of dark eyes and gentle hands, wondering if it were possible to fall in love with a man she was not certain she could trust. The next morning brought news that would shatter her growing contentment. Lady Helena burst into her chambers with a letter bearing her father's personal seal, correspondence that had been discovered hidden among Captain Dernwald's effects. With trembling fingers, Emilia broke the wax and read her father's final words. The letter spoke of threats against his life, of a conspiracy involving members of his own court, and of specific evidence pointing to Nathaniel's regiment being present in the palace on the night of the king's death. The letter felt like ice in Emilia's hands as she read it again, each word cutting deeper than the last. Her father's precise handwriting laid out his fears with devastating clarity. The whispered meetings in darkened corridors, the servants who had noticed strange men in the palace after midnight, and most damning of all, the report of Lord Harrow's regiment being granted unusual access to the royal quarters on the night King Wilhelm died. For 3 days, she carried this knowledge, like a poisoned dagger pressed against her heart. She watched Nathaniel during their training sessions, studied his face for signs of guilt or deception, and found herself growing more confused rather than more certain. The man who spoke so passionately about justice, who had defended her honor and shared his deepest grief, could he truly be capable of patricide? The confrontation came on a rain-soaked evening as they sheltered in the same chapel where they had first acknowledged their growing attraction. The small sanctuary seemed to close around them, lit only by a handful of flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. "Were you there?" The words tore from her throat like shards of glass. "The night my father died, were you in the palace?" Nathaniel went very still, his dark eyes searching her face in the candlelight. She saw the exact moment he realized what she had learned, watched as his expression shifted from surprise to resignation to something that might have been relief. "Yes," he said simply. "I was there." The admission hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Part of her had hoped, prayed, that there was some explanation, some misunderstanding that would clear his name and allow her to keep the fragile love that had been growing between them. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "He trusted you, he favored you, and you repaid that kindness with murder?" Nathaniel flinched as if she had struck him. "It was not murder, Emilia. At least, that was never the intention." "Then what? What could possibly justify justice?" The word exploded from him with such force that she stepped back in shock. "Or what I thought was justice, before I understood the full truth of your father's character." He began to pace the small space like a caged wolf, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Do you know what it is to watch children starve while grain rots in royal warehouses? To see families broken by taxes designed to fund another ball, another hunt, another display of aristocratic excess? That wasn't my father. I know that now." He whirled to face her, and she saw tears glittering in his eyes. "But then I saw only the crown, not the man who wore it. The conspiracy approached me when I was half mad with grief, when Margaret's death was still fresh and bleeding in my soul. They spoke of forcing abdication, of creating change through necessity rather than waiting for royal benevolence." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I believed them when they said no one would be harmed. I thought we would corner him, present evidence of noble corruption, force him to dismiss the worst of his advisers, and implement immediate reforms. I never knew they planned to poison him until it was too late." The rain hammered against the chapel windows like accusatory fingers, filling the silence that stretched between them. Emilia felt as though her world was crumbling around her. First her father's death, now the discovery that the man she had begun to love was complicit in that loss. "You could have stopped them," she said, her voice hollow with grief. "By the time I understood their true intentions, your father was already dying. I stayed with him, I held his hand as he passed, and swore to him that I would protect you. that I would find a way to make amends for my part in this tragedy. The image of her proud father dying in the arms of his murderer sent fresh waves of anguish through her chest. "Get out," she whispered. "Get out before I scream for the guards and have you arrested for treason." Nathaniel moved toward the door with leaden steps, but paused on the threshold. "I know you will never forgive me, but I need you to know every moment we spent together, every word of affection, every touch, it was real. What I feel for you is the truest thing in my life, even if I have no right to it." After he left, Emilia sank to her knees before the altar and wept until she had no tears left. The love that had been blooming in her heart felt poisoned now, tainted by blood and betrayal. Yet underneath the pain, a treacherous part of her wondered if his anguish might be as genuine as her own. The next morning brought Duke Rothstein and half the Privy Council to her chambers, their faces grave with purpose. They had discovered Lord Harrow's involvement in the king's death, they claimed, and demanded that she publicly renounce their betrothal and agree to a more suitable match, specifically to the Duke himself. "The kingdom requires stability, Your Highness," Rothstein said, with oily sympathy. "Surely you see that marriage to a traitor would destroy any hope of legitimacy for your reign." Standing there in her nightgown with her hair unbound, Emilia had never felt more alone. The men who surrounded her bed saw only an opportunity to seize power through her body and her crown. None of them cared about justice for her father or protection for her people. They wanted only to position themselves at the center of influence. "I will consider your counsel," she said carefully, "but I will make no decisions while my grief is still fresh." After they left, she realized with crystalline clarity that she stood at a crossroads that would define not only her own fate, but the future of everyone she had sworn to protect. The easy path lay in accepting Rothstein's proposal and letting Nathaniel face the executioner's block. The harder road would require her to dig deeper into the conspiracy that had killed her father and decide for herself whether justice lay in vengeance or in something far more complex. In the sleepless nights that followed her confrontation with Nathaniel, Princess Emilia discovered reservoirs of strength she had never known she possessed. While the court buzzed with rumors and the Duke of Rothstein pressed his advantage, she began her own investigation into the conspiracy that had claimed her father's life. Lady Helena proved invaluable in this endeavor, using her connections among the servants to uncover details that had escaped the official inquiry. Together, they traced a web of corruption that reached far deeper than Nathaniel's reluctant participation. The true architects of the plot were men who had grown rich on the suffering of the poor, nobles who saw King Wilhelm's reforms as threats to their comfortable supremacy. "Look at this," Helena whispered one midnight as they huddled over stolen documents in Emilia's chambers. "Lord Hartwell's correspondence with the Duke. They planned your father's death months in advance, but they needed a soldier, someone with military access to the palace, to carry out their scheme." Emilia studied the letter with growing horror and understanding. They used Nathaniel's grief as a weapon against him. They fed his anger, promised him justice, then manipulated him into becoming their unwitting tool. The evidence painted a clear picture. Nathaniel had indeed been present when her father died, but as a deceived pawn rather than a willing assassin. The true poison had been administered by Duke Rothstein's personal physician, who had disappeared from the kingdom immediately after the king's death. Armed with this knowledge, Emilia knew she faced the most dangerous gamble of her life. She could expose the conspiracy and save Nathaniel, but doing so would make her a target of the same forces that had destroyed her father. The safe choice remained accepting Rothstein's proposal and allowing an innocent man to die for crimes committed by his manipulators. The decision crystallized on the morning she learned that Nathaniel had voluntarily surrendered himself to the palace guards. Rather than flee the kingdom, as any sensible man would have done, he had returned to face execution, not because he believed himself innocent, but because he could not bear to let her suffer the consequences of their association. Standing before her mirror as Helena arranged her hair for the day's court session, Emilia met her own eyes with newfound resolve. "Send word to Captain Durnwald. Tell him I require his testimony before the full council this afternoon." "Your Highness, that's dangerous? Foolish? Potentially treasonous?" Emilia's smile held steel. "Perhaps, but it is also right." The great hall had never felt more like a battlefield than it did that afternoon. Duke Rustin sat in the place of honor, clearly expecting to hear Emilia's public renunciation of her betrothal and acceptance of his suit. The other nobles whispered among themselves with the gleeful anticipation of vultures circling fresh carrion. When Emilia rose to address the assembly, every conversation ceased. She had chosen her clothing carefully, not the submissive pastels they expected, but the deep blue and gold of royal authority. Her father's signet ring caught the light as she lifted her hand for silence. "Lords and gentlemen of the court," she began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. "You have asked me to denounce Lord Nathaniel Harrow as a traitor and murderer. Before I render judgment, I would have you hear the full truth of my father's death." What followed was the most dangerous performance of her life. With Captain Durnwald's reluctant testimony and the evidence she and Helena had gathered, she methodically dismantled the fiction of Nathaniel's guilt and revealed the web of greed and ambition that had truly killed King Wilhelm. Duke Rostin's face grew progressively paler as she spoke, and several other nobles began edging toward the exits as their own involvement became clear. But Emilia was not finished. Lord Harrow's crime was not murder, she declared, but rather the sin of allowing grief to cloud his judgment. He was used by men who understood that a heart broken by injustice could be shaped into a weapon against the very ideals it sought to protect. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled court. "I will not punish a man for being deceived by those who should have been his betters, nor will I reward the true architects of my father's murder by accepting their puppet as my husband." The hall erupted in chaos, shouts of outrage from Rostein's faction, calls for order from the moderates, and stunned silence from those still processing the implications of her revelations. Through it all, Emilia stood unmoved, her chin raised in defiance of every expectation they had held about her. When Nathaniel was brought before her in chains, his eyes widened at the sight of her standing in judgment rather than cowering in submission. She saw the exact moment he understood what she had done, the risks she had taken not just for justice, but for him. "Lord Harrow," she said formally, "you have been accused of treason against the crown. How do you answer?" His voice was steady despite the circumstances. "I am guilty of allowing my judgment to be compromised by grief and anger. Your Highness, I accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate. Then I sentence you to a lifetime of service, not to the crown, but to the principles my father died trying to uphold. Will you accept this burden?" The hope that flared in his eyes was answer enough, but he spoke the words that would bind them together before God and witnesses. "I will, my lady. With my life and honor, I will." As the guards removed his chains and Duke Rostein was led away under arrest, Emilia felt the weight of true power settle on her shoulders. She had chosen love over safety, justice over convenience, and in doing so had discovered who she truly meant to be. But 5 years had passed since that tumultuous day in the Great Hall, 5 years that had transformed not only the kingdom but the two people who now ruled it side by side. Princess Emilia, now queen in her own right, sat beneath the ancient oak tree in the palace gardens, watching her 3-year-old son chase butterflies through the dappled sunlight. The child had Nathaniel's dark hair and her own blue eyes, but his laughter was purely his own, bright and unguarded in a way that neither of his parents had been allowed to be at his age. Little Wilhelm, named for the grandfather he would never meet, represented everything they had fought to build, a future where noble blood and common birth mattered less than character and compassion. "He has your stubborn streak," Nathaniel said as he settled beside her on the stone bench, his voice warm with affection. "Did you see him this morning lecturing Cook about the proper way to feed the kitchen cats?" Emilia laughed, leaning into her husband's solid warmth. The years had been kind to them both, the sharp edges of grief and guilt softened by time and honest work. Nathaniel's face still bore the marks of his hard youth, but contentment had eased the harsh lines around his eyes. As for herself, she had discovered that true queenship suited her far better than the decorative princesshood of her youth. "He learned that from you," she accused playfully. "You're the one who insists that every creature in the kingdom deserves proper care." It was true. Under their joint rule, the reforms King Wilhelm had envisioned had finally taken root. The crushing taxes had been restructured to fall more heavily on those who could afford them. Grain warehouses remained open during times of scarcity, and schools had been established even in the remotest villages. The changes had not come without cost. Several noble families had fled to neighboring kingdoms rather than accept the new order, but those who remained had grudgingly learned to adapt. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathaniel asked quietly, his hand finding hers among the folds of her simple day dress. "The path we chose, the enemies we made." Emilia considered the question seriously, as she did all of his moments of doubt. There were still those at court who whispered about the farmer's son who had married above his station, still nobles who treated her with barely concealed resentment for her reforms. The Duke of Rothstein might be dead, executed for his crimes, but his allies remained, watching for any sign of weakness. "I regret the pain it took to reach this place," she said finally. "I regret that my father never lived to see his grandson, never knew that his dreams would flourish, but regret our choice. Never." Their son's delighted shriek drew their attention as he finally managed to catch one of the orange butterflies that had been taunting him. Rather than harm the delicate creature, he cupped it gently in his small hands and brought it to show them, his face glowing with wonder. "Mama, Papa, look, it tickles." As they admired his prize and helped him release it safely back to the garden, Emilia felt the profound satisfaction that came from knowing they had chosen correctly. Love had not been the easy path. It had demanded everything from both of them, forced them to confront their own weaknesses and fight for something greater than themselves. But love, she had learned, was never about ease. It was about finding someone worth fighting beside, worth building something beautiful and lasting with, worth facing an uncertain future alongside. In Nathaniel's steady presence and their son's bright laughter, in the letters of gratitude from common folk, whose lives had been touched by their policies, in the slow but steady transformation of their kingdom from a place of rigid hierarchy to something approaching justice, in all of these things she saw the fruit of that choice. As the afternoon sun slanted through the oak leaves and painted them all in gold, Nathaniel lifted their son to his shoulders and offered Emilia his free hand. Together, they walked back toward the palace that had once been her prison and was now truly her home. Their shadows intertwining on the garden path like the lives they had woven together through trial and triumph. Behind them, the butterflies danced in the warm air, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten page, full of possibility, anchored by love and bright with the promise of all they would build together in the years to come.